James Harper always stood out. He was the type of man who seemed born to win. With a confident look and calculated gestures, he commanded businesses like a maestro conducts an orchestra, achieving impeccable results and great power. However, behind that shine of success, there was an emptiness. He might be applauded by his peers, but emotionally, he was like an isolated island. He always believed that material success was the only way to fill that void, but the truth is that the more he accumulated, the more distant he felt from what truly mattered. He didn't realize the effect his actions had on others. In his mind, manipulating situations and people was just part of the game of life, and he played to win. That was the rule. However, James never looked at the faces of those he left behind. To him, everything was just a transaction, something without emotional consequences. He believed that weakness was for those who lacked the necessary determination to reach the top. His arrogant demeanor hid a vulnerability he didn't even know existed. His personal relationships were like his businesses, calculated, superficial, and without deep bonds. He maintained a restricted circle of friends who, like him, valued success above all. One of these friends was Ryan, a man who also shared the same competitive view of life. Together, they formed a duo that loved to push boundaries, especially when pride was at stake. In that environment, conversations were always about power, money, and control, rarely involving any trace of true friendship. James had reached the peak of his career, but, curiously, he felt that something was slipping away. Although he had never admitted it to himself, his personal life was an emotional desert. He knew how to win, but he didn't know how to connect. Maybe that was what kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what more he could achieve to finally feel that he had completed something. The emptiness grew, but he continued to ignore it, diving deeper into his cold and calculated transactions. The smiles around him were always fake, reflecting only the superficiality of his achievements. There were moments when James questioned if that was enough. He had everything, but he felt like something was missing that he could never define. This void was something he pushed to the back of his mind, preferring to focus on contracts, meetings, and the next big deal. In his world, weakness was synonymous with failure, and he was not willing to be seen as someone fragile. The success he had built was based on an incessant need to prove something to himself. Each victory served as a form of validation, but still, it was never enough. James was trapped in a spiral of empty achievements, not understanding that perhaps true overcoming wasn't about accumulating more, but about discovering why he was never satisfied. Inside himself, he struggled against this dissatisfaction but never allowed it to surface. His pride prevented him from recognizing his own flaws. Everything seemed to be under control, but the discomfort grew. James didn't allow himself to stop and reflect on what really mattered. His arrogance kept him away from any introspection. And that's how he continued, day after day, believing that financial success would bring the happiness he so sought. But the emptiness was always present, like a silent shadow. What he didn't yet know was that, soon, his life would take a completely different turn, and that sense of control he so valued would be shaken. Despite all his success, James was unaware of the true meaning of happiness and fulfillment. He believed that satisfaction would come with the next big deal or another victory. However, the feeling of incompleteness followed him like a dark cloud. And then, amidst this incessant search for external validation, an unexpected opportunity arose. A bet that seemed, at first glance, just another game to feed his ego. What he couldn't foresee was the impact that this simple challenge would have on his life. The sense of control he had always cultivated so diligently was about to be challenged in a way he could never have imagined. But, as usual, James didn't allow himself to deeply reflect on what was to come. He was convinced that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage. After all, it had always been that way. Little did he know that he was about to cross a line that would make him question everything he believed about what true overcoming was. It was during a business trip to Las Vegas that James Harper's life began to change, even though he had no idea about it. Amidst drinks and conversations about million-dollar investments, his longtime friend, Ryan, made a proposal. They loved challenges, and this seemed like one of those bets that arose in the heat of the moment. Ryan's proposal was simple but strange. James would have to marry a woman completely outside his standards for 6 months. If he succeeded, a generous sum of money awaited him at the end. James laughed at the idea. Marrying as part of a bet? It seemed absurd, but also an irresistible opportunity to show once again that he was capable of winning in any situation. Money wasn't exactly the motivation. It was more than he could spend in several lifetimes, but the challenge of bending someone to his will, of showing he could manipulate any circumstance, that was something that stirred his ego. Besides, Ryan knew his vanity and knew that a challenge like this would be impossible to resist. Without thinking twice, James accepted. It wasn't as if he was seeking love or a true connection. Ryan, always looking for a provocation, knew exactly how to mess with James's ego. When he suggested Evelyn Scott for the bet, the choice wasn't random. Evelyn was far from the conventional beauty standards James usually valued. She was a plus-size woman, with curves that would never be seen alongside him at gala events. Ryan knew this would hit James's pride in a particular way. After all, James had always made sure to keep women by his side who fit what he considered perfect. The bet, therefore, wasn't just a challenge to his ego but a disguised humiliation. When James and Evelyn met for the first time, he stayed in the role he knew so well, the confident, almost arrogant man. Evelyn, on the other hand, surprised him. She wasn't intimidated by James's imposing presence. On the contrary, her confident and calm demeanor, her good-humored and unpretentious manner contrasted with the controlled and calculated air James always displayed. Evelyn had a silent strength that James, in his superficiality, had never noticed in anyone. This bothered and intrigued him at the same time. For James, the plan was simple. He would do with Evelyn what he always did with people, conquer her with expensive gifts, luxurious dinners, and empty promises. However, as the days passed, he realized that Evelyn didn't react like the other women he was used to controlling. She was polite and kind but didn't seem impressed by his grand gestures. As the details of the agreement unfolded, James already imagined himself in control of the situation. He knew Evelyn would be a difficult person to deal with, but he was convinced he could bend her over time. After all, who could resist his fortune and charm? He saw himself as the winner from the beginning, certain that, sooner or later, she would give in. What he didn't yet understand was how prepared Evelyn was to turn the game around, making this bet something much more than he could ever foresee. The bet represented not only an opportunity to test his limits but also to reaffirm what he had always believed, that everything and everyone can be manipulated as long as you know the right pieces to move. James was confident. People had always been like chess pieces in his hands, and Evelyn would be no different. He underestimated the depth of the emotions involved and, even more, he underestimated who she really was. However, like all great transformation stories, James was about to discover that some battles cannot be won with the mere power of his will. The marriage to Evelyn, which initially seemed just an emotionless formality, would begin to test everything James believed about himself and the world. He didn't yet know, but this bet would put him on a path of overcoming very different from what he was used to. It wasn't about winning over Evelyn or controlling the situation. It was about facing his own demons, something he wasn't yet prepared to acknowledge. Pride, which had accompanied him for so long, would be his first great enemy on this journey. By accepting the bet, James had taken the first step towards a transformation he couldn't yet see. What seemed to him like a game, a playful way to reaffirm his power and control, would soon become a much deeper personal challenge. Life was about to teach him that true value isn't in material achievements but in the ability to see beyond one's own ego. James entered the marriage with Evelyn with the same confidence that had always accompanied him in his endeavors. To him, it was just a formality, a temporary game. He knew he would need to pretend for a while, but he was convinced that, with his usual tricks, he could control the situation. After all, he had always had the power to manipulate the people around him. Deep down, he believed that Evelyn, like all the others, would eventually succumb to his influence. He was sure he could win this bet without any major complications. However, as the days went by, James began to realize that his attempts to impress Evelyn were not working as he expected. James's initial plan started to fail, and he refused to admit that something was out of his control. He didn't know, but this was the first sign that the real battle was within him. Gradually, James began to realize that he was dealing with a different kind of woman. Evelyn wasn't easily influenced by status or money. She demonstrated an independence he had never encountered before, and it deeply irritated him. James still saw the marriage as a passing obligation, something he would endure for 6 months and then leave behind. But as Evelyn continued to resist his advances, he began to feel increasingly frustrated and confused. Living with Evelyn forced James to confront something he had never faced, the idea that he couldn't control everything. In other moments of his life, he would have given up or simply found another way to manipulate the situation. But there, trapped by the bet, he needed to continue. And each day beside Evelyn made him feel he was facing a much bigger challenge than he had anticipated. He began to internally refuse to accept what this situation was teaching him. Evelyn's demeanor intrigued him. She didn't show weakness, didn't give in to his advances. In fact, she seemed to need nothing he offered. This confused James in a way he wasn't used to. He, who had always known how to control the course of things, found himself for the first time in a situation where his tactics were ineffective. He refused to admit he might be failing. After all, for James, failure was not an option. This made him try even more desperately to bend Evelyn to his will. Over the months, James refused to look inside himself. He didn't want to admit that what was happening there went far beyond a simple bet. Evelyn was forcing him to see himself in a way he had never done before, and that scared him. He still tried to maintain the facade of control, but something inside him began to waver. Increasingly frustrated, he insisted on using his old tactics to bend her. But as time passed, he began to feel that he might be fighting the wrong battle. Evelyn wasn't the kind of woman who could be won over with superficial gestures. And, although he refused to admit it, this realization began to penetrate his consciousness. James didn't know yet, but what he feared most was about to be revealed. Gradually, James began to realize he was facing something much bigger than a bet. He refused to believe he could lose, but the game was already changing. Evelyn wasn't just a difficult opponent to beat. She was challenging him to be a different person, and that put him in conflict with himself. James found himself caught between the desire to win and the growing perception that he might need to change to truly achieve something valuable. Evelyn undoubtedly became the figure James never imagined he would need in his life. She wasn't a mentor in the traditional sense, but with her confidence and determination, she forced James to confront the parts of himself he had avoided for years. From the beginning of the marriage, Evelyn maintained a firm stance. She knew what she wanted from life, and the fact that James was rich and influential didn't shake her. On the contrary, she saw through his facade of power and saw a lost man trapped in his own arrogance. James, on the other hand, couldn't understand why his charms and manipulation attempts weren't working with Evelyn. He was used to being admired, to having people willing to do what he wanted. But Evelyn wasn't like that. She was independent, and that deeply affected him. With each conversation, each interaction, James felt as if he was being challenged to rethink his attitudes. Evelyn made him question whether his success and power really mattered, if they were enough to fill the void he felt but never admitted. James found himself increasingly attracted to Evelyn's silent strength. He couldn't fully understand her, but he knew there was something in her he needed to discover. For the first time, he began to realize that there was more to a person than their appearance or what they could offer. Evelyn didn't fit James's standards, and it was precisely that made him start to see her differently. She wasn't someone he could dominate. She was someone he needed to understand. Living with Evelyn began to awaken something in James. He had never considered the idea that he could learn from another person, especially a woman he initially underestimated so much. But Evelyn left him no choice. She was relentless in her independence, and that forced James to confront his own weaknesses. He began to see that the problem wasn't Evelyn not submitting to his control. The real problem was him not knowing how to deal with someone who didn't need him. The challenge Evelyn represented for James was greater than any business or bet he had ever faced. She was forcing him to grow in a way he had never imagined. She was the first person in his life who wasn't afraid to confront him, who didn't bow to his presence. And in some way that inspired him. He wasn't ready to admit this openly, but Evelyn was changing the way he saw the world and, more importantly, the way he saw himself. As time passed, James began to realize that if he ever wanted to earn Evelyn's respect, he would have to change. He would have to let go of his pride and obsession with control. Evelyn wasn't there to be molded by him. She was a force in her own right. And beside her, James began to question his own beliefs and attitudes. He was being led on a path of self-discovery he had never walked before. And Evelyn, unknowingly, was responsible for that. Evelyn didn't make grand gestures, didn't try to teach James directly. But her mere presence and the way she lived her life were enough to provoke a silent change within him. Each day, James learned more about himself, even if he didn't want to admit it. He began to see that life was much more than power and control. And this new perspective scared him, but at the same time, it fascinated him. James was facing a transformation he could no longer ignore. Unbeknownst to him, Evelyn was leading James on a journey of self-discovery. She was the missing piece for him to start questioning himself and seeing beyond his own ego. And, although James still resisted, trying to maintain control over the situation, he knew deep down that Evelyn was changing him in a way he couldn't reverse. This encounter with her, which he initially dismissed, was becoming the greatest lesson of his life. James's frustration grew each day. He began to try new methods, hoping that eventually one of them would work. Instead of gifts, he tried to make Evelyn depend on him emotionally, creating situations where she would need his help. However, Evelyn was self-sufficient and never fell into his emotional traps. James's friends also noticed the change. Ryan, who had initiated the entire situation with the bet, watched the relationship unfold with interest. To him, James was finally being challenged in a way he had never been before. He saw that his friend was beginning to lose control, something James would never allow others to notice. Although Ryan's intention with the bet was to provoke, he was curious to see how far James would go. However, even he didn't imagine that Evelyn would be so resistant. Amidst this internal battle, James began to see Evelyn not as an adversary but as a force he couldn't fully understand. He still saw her as an enemy in his path to winning the bet, but also someone who made him reflect on his own life. Each interaction between them became a test of patience and strength, and James found himself losing in both. He didn't know yet, but each failure was bringing him closer to a truth he tried to avoid at all costs. Evelyn, for her part, didn't see James as an enemy, though she was well aware of the games he was trying to play. She maintained her firm stance, not letting James's manipulations shake her. In many moments, she even felt compassion for him. Evelyn realized that James was lost, desperately trying to hold onto something he didn't understand. Although she knew it was part of a bet, she began to see the real James reveal himself behind his facade. And it was in this process that she began to slowly lower her emotional defenses. James was surrounded by constant tests, but the greatest challenge was himself. He couldn't accept that maybe, for the first time, he wasn't able to control the course of things. Evelyn wasn't a puzzle he could solve with money or charm. She demanded something much deeper from him. And, in the process of trying to break her, James began to break himself. With each failure, he was forced to look more closely at his own weaknesses, at the parts of himself he had always avoided confronting. While James tried to manipulate Evelyn, he was also being manipulated by his own insecurities. He began to wonder why this mattered so much to him. What did it really mean to win this bet? Each passing day, the answer became less clear. What he thought was a simple matter of pride and control was turning into an internal battle to understand what truly moved him. And Evelyn, unknowingly, was the key to this transformation. James began to realize that he himself was his greatest enemy, fighting against his own beliefs and fears. Evelyn, in a way, became his ally, even without wanting to. Her resistance wasn't just a barrier, it was the mirror that showed James everything he needed to confront. The line between winning and losing began to dissolve as James started to see that, to overcome Evelyn, he would first need to overcome himself. As time went on, the tensions between James and Evelyn reached an unbearable point. It was then, when James was on the brink of his own emotional exhaustion, that Evelyn made a devastating revelation. Sitting at the kitchen table, in a moment of apparent tranquility, she revealed something that would shake James's world in a way he could never have predicted. Evelyn revealed that years ago, her father had been one of the many businessmen harmed by James's relentless business dealings. At that time, James had orchestrated a merger that ended up destroying Evelyn's father's company, leading him to bankruptcy and public shame. The impact was devastating, and her father, unable to cope with the humiliation, had taken his own life. Evelyn's words fell on James like a ton of bricks, and for the first time, he felt the true weight of his actions. It was no longer a game. He had ruined a life and caused irreparable pain. The revelation left him stunned. James had always seen his businesses as transactions, cold and impersonal, something necessary for success. He had never stopped to consider the human impact of his decisions. Evelyn's father's death was a consequence he would not have foreseen. And now, the woman he was trying to manipulate, the one who resisted him so determinedly, was standing before him, revealing a pain he had caused himself. The gravity of what he had done hit him with overwhelming force. Evelyn, with a calm that only deep pain can bring, explained that when she accepted the marriage, she already knew about the bet and didn't do it for fun or money. For her, this marriage wasn't a game. It was a form of revenge, a way to make James feel the impotence and humiliation her father had felt. She knew James saw her as a woman outside his standards, someone easy to manipulate. And that was exactly why she accepted the challenge. She wanted him to feel the frustration of not being able to control something, the same frustration her father felt when he saw his company and life crumble. Evelyn's words resonated deeply with James. The revelation was like a blow to his pride, to everything he believed about himself. For the first time, he saw himself as the villain of the story, and it devastated him. He realized that his actions, those he had always considered as simple business decisions, had caused real and tangible pain. The game he thought he was playing with Evelyn wasn't a game for her. It was a chance to make him face the weight of his choices. At that moment, James began to realize the extent of his own blindness. He had always believed that success justified any action, but now he saw that the price of his ambition was much higher than he had imagined. Evelyn's father's death weighed on his conscience in a way he had never experienced before. He began to question not only his past decisions but the entire belief system that guided him. For the first time, James felt ashamed of who he was. Evelyn's revelation changed everything. James knew he could never fix what he had done, but he also knew that somehow he needed to make peace with himself and with her. He realized it wasn't just a matter of saying sorry, it was about transforming the person he was. Evelyn had forced James to enter his deepest cave, the space where he would have to confront his mistakes and character flaws. And even without wanting to, she was guiding him on a journey of self-discovery and redemption. Now, their relationship was at a crossroads. James knew he couldn't continue as before. The weight of guilt was too great, and he found himself unable to maintain the arrogant facade he had always used as a shield. Evelyn had completely disarmed him. He was vulnerable like never before and knew the path ahead would be difficult. The humiliation he felt now was different from anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the humiliation of losing a game. It was the overwhelming weight of realizing that his actions had caused deep and irreparable suffering. James felt he was at the bottom of the pit. Evelyn's revelation had destroyed him from within. Guilt consumed him. The man who had always believed himself to be untouchable, who had never stopped to think about the consequences of his actions, was now facing a harsh and relentless truth. He wasn't the winner he had always believed himself to be. In many ways, he was the villain. The guilt Evelyn had awakened in James was something he had never felt before. It was an acute pain, a feeling of emptiness and remorse that accompanied him every moment of the day. He could barely sleep. The image of Evelyn's father, a man he had never met but whose life he had ruined, hovered over his conscience like a ghost. He wondered how he had been capable of being so blind, so selfish. James had always believed that success justified everything, but now he found himself questioning every one of his choices. This confrontation with his own guilt was something James didn't know how to handle. He tried, for a few weeks, to return to his usual behavior. He tried to convince himself that this pain would pass, that he could simply move on. But none of that worked. The guilt was overwhelming, and he could no longer pretend to be the same man as before. Something inside him had changed. Evelyn, with her revelation, had broken the armor he used to protect himself from the world. Now, he was naked before his own conscience, and the sight was anything but pleasant. The humiliation he felt now was completely different from any defeat he had ever experienced. It wasn't the failure in a business or the loss of a bet. It was something much deeper. It was the failure as a human being. James was beginning to realize that the life he had built, based on power, money, and control, meant nothing in the face of the pain he had caused. He felt the weight of every decision, every ruthless transaction, and knew he couldn't simply apologize and move on. Evelyn, for her part, watched this transformation from afar. She knew James was facing his own demons but didn't interfere. She wasn't there to save him, nor did she want him to believe she would easily forgive him. She knew James would need to face this trial alone, that he would need to find within himself the strength to change. And as she watched the internal struggle he was fighting, Evelyn remained firm in her position. She still carried the pain of losing her father and knew that the path to forgiveness would be long. James was facing a dilemma. He knew he needed to change but didn't know how. His entire life had been built around a model that was now collapsing. And changing meant abandoning the man he had always believed himself to be. It was more than difficult. It was terrifying. However, he knew that continuing on the same path was not an option. He had hit rock bottom and, for the first time, felt there was no turning back. The transformation was inevitable, but the process would be painful. James's ultimate trial wasn't about winning over Evelyn or saving their marriage. It was about saving himself. He began to understand that to overcome the pain he felt, he would need to redeem himself, not just in Evelyn's eyes but before his own conscience. James's journey towards redemption was neither quick nor easy. He knew that it wasn't enough to apologize to Evelyn or try to correct past mistakes with words. It was necessary to prove, through sincere actions, that he had changed. The path to this began humbly. Instead of trying to win back Evelyn with gifts or grand gestures, James began to act simply but genuinely. He started to open up, to show vulnerability, something he had never done before. The first steps were the hardest. Evelyn, still hurt by the revelations in the past, wasn't willing to trust James quickly. She watched from afar, maintaining her firm stance, but now there was something different. She noticed small signs of change in James. He was no longer the arrogant man who tried to manipulate everything and everyone around him. Gradually, he showed that he was willing to give up control. Every gesture of kindness, every word spoken without pretense, revealed that James was beginning to understand the true value of humility. James began to repair not only his relationship with Evelyn but also with other people he had harmed along the way. He knew he couldn't fix everything, but he also knew it was his responsibility to try. He started reaching out to those who had been affected by his ruthless decisions, offering compensation and, in many cases, simply listening to their stories. For the first time, he allowed himself to see people as human beings, not as pieces in a power game. This was one of the greatest steps in his transformation. However, the reward James sought wasn't in a quick absolution. He knew he would need to build his redemption day by day, with effort and patience. And Evelyn, even maintaining an emotional distance, began to notice the sincerity in his actions. There was no more manipulation. James was learning to respect Evelyn's space, to recognize that he had no right to control or shape her feelings. He was finally beginning to understand what it meant to love someone without demanding anything in return. The relationship between James and Evelyn slowly began to transform. She didn't fully trust him, but she also couldn't ignore the changes she saw. There were small moments of complicity, looks that hadn't existed before. James still felt guilty for what he had done to Evelyn's father, but instead of trying to hide this guilt, he carried it with him as a constant reminder of who he no longer wanted to be. The change was real, and Evelyn, no matter how resistant she was beginning to give in. James also began to see the world in a completely different way. He, who once saw people only as means to an end, now saw the importance of each human being in their own journey. He began to appreciate simplicity, something he had previously considered insignificant. Every gesture, every small act of affection or kindness now held much greater value for him. The reward wasn't material but something he had never experienced before, the inner peace of knowing he was becoming a better person. The major turning point for James was when he finally managed to look at himself in the mirror and recognize his flaws without feeling ashamed. He had spent his entire life hiding his vulnerabilities, afraid that they would make him appear weak. Now, he understood that true strength lay in admitting his mistakes and doing everything possible to correct them. Evelyn was a fundamental part of this process, even without knowing it. She was the catalyst that forced him to change, and for that he was eternally grateful. James's reward, however, wasn't something he could simply take and keep. It was a continuous journey, a process of self-knowledge and growth that he would need to cultivate daily. He knew there was still much to do, but now, for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. The transformation Evelyn provoked in him was profound, and James was finally beginning to accept that not everything in life was about winning. Sometimes, the greatest victory was simply learning to be a better person. The relationship with Evelyn, although still marked by the scars of the past, also began to blossom differently. She wasn't ready to fully forgive him, but the barrier between them was decreasing. Evelyn, with her silent wisdom, watched every step James took. She knew he was trying, but she also knew that true change takes time. Still, little by little, small moments of complicity began to resurface. Conversations were less tense, and there was a certain lightness that started to return. James, for his part, knew he couldn't rush the process of reconquering her. He had learned that respect and trust are built over time, not with grand gestures. His patience, once non-existent, was now his greatest ally. He was willing to give Evelyn the space she needed to process everything that had happened. For him, the mere fact that she was willing to stay by his side, even cautiously, was a sign of hope. It was proof that the change within him was beginning to reflect in the outside world. During this process of reconquest, James also began to make peace with his past. He knew he couldn't undo the mistakes he had made, but he could try to remedy some of the consequences. He started helping those who, in one way or another, had been harmed by his ruthless decisions. This wasn't an empty apology, it was a sincere effort to make a difference. He understood that his actions weren't just cold transactions, they had real impacts on people's lives, and this now weighed on his conscience in a way it never had before. The relationship between James and Evelyn slowly began to rebuild. It wasn't a quick and dramatic reconciliation. It was something much more subtle. Evelyn began to see that the man before her wasn't the same one who had entered the marriage as part of a futile bet. James was changing, and she was willing to give him the chance to show who he could truly be. But, at the same time, Evelyn wasn't willing to accept less than she deserved. She knew her worth and knew that if James wanted to be by her side, he would have to prove that the change was lasting. James felt he was on a continuous journey of redemption. He knew that Evelyn's forgiveness, as well as forgiving himself, wouldn't come overnight. But the mere fact of being on this path, of working every day to be a better person, was already a victory. He no longer wanted to control the people around him. On the contrary, he wanted to build relationships based on respect and equality. And that, more than anything else, was what drove him to continue on his path of transformation. As James followed this path back, he also began to find a new internal peace. The void that had always accompanied him, even in his moments of greatest success, was now beginning to be filled. Not with material achievements or power, but with the simple act of reconnecting with himself and with others. James realized that true happiness wasn't in dominating the world around him, but in being able to live in harmony with it. This was the greatest gift his journey of redemption had given him so far. Evelyn, although cautious, began to let her guard down. She noticed that James wasn't just talking about change but was living it through his daily actions. He had learned to listen, to respect her space, to value the small things he had once ignored. This made her reconsider the future. There could indeed be a new beginning for both of them, but Evelyn knew that this decision couldn't be made in haste. She needed more time, more proof that this change was permanent. James was willing to give her that time. This emotional rebirth of James also brought a new perspective on what it truly meant to live with purpose. He moved away from the old habits that kept him trapped in the cycle of power and control. Instead of chasing more financial success, he began to focus on building deeper connections with the people around him. He started to appreciate simplicity, something he had previously considered a weakness. Now, every genuine conversation, every small act of kindness brought him more satisfaction than any material achievement ever had. What surprised James most was the peace he began to feel. The man who once couldn't sleep without thinking about the next deal, the next challenge, now found tranquility in simply being present. He began to realize that success wasn't something he needed to chase incessantly. Instead, he could find it in the small victories of everyday life, in gestures of kindness, and in respecting others. This new James wasn't perfect, but he was a man in constant growth, willing to keep learning and improving. Some time later, when things seemed to finally be settling in James's life, Ryan reappeared. He still remembered the bet they had made, and with his usual carefree tone, he approached James to settle the score. After all, the 6-month deadline had passed, and James had fulfilled his part of the agreement. Ryan, without hesitation, offered the promised money, as if he were handing over a prize to his old friend. But this time, the James in front of him was someone completely different. James looked at Ryan and, for the first time, felt the real weight of what that bet had represented. He felt neither anger nor bitterness but a deep gratitude. Ryan, who had initiated everything with a provocation, unknowingly had placed him on a path that would change his life forever. The money, which before would have been the center of any negotiation for James, now meant nothing compared to what he had gained. Without hesitation, James refused the offer, completely surprising Ryan. With a calm smile, James said to Ryan, "I don't need that money. The bet was, without a doubt, the best thing that ever happened to my life." Ryan fell silent, confused for a moment. To him, it had always been a joke, a way to challenge James and test his limits. But now, he saw that something much greater had happened. James, who was once driven by pride and the need to win, was now a transformed man with an inner peace that Ryan couldn't fully understand. James continued, "I didn't win this bet because of money or some kind of victory you or I expected. I won because, through it, I discovered what truly matters. I learned to love genuinely. And more than that, I became a better person. What you gave me was the opportunity to see who I really was and to change. Nothing in this world could be worth more than that." Ryan, who was once ready to joke and hand over the payment, now listened attentively, realizing how much James had changed. Evelyn, who was close enough to hear the conversation, smiled slightly. She knew how much this moment meant to James. He had left behind the man who lived for status and power and now presented himself as someone who finally understood the true value of life. What started as a cruel and reckless bet transformed into a journey of self-discovery and love. James was reciting to Ryan the lessons he had learned during the most challenging months of his life. Ryan, still in shock at James's response, tried to insist, "But, James, you won the bet. You deserve the money. That was the deal, remember?" But James, now calmer and more self-assured, just shook his head. "That money means nothing to me now. What I gained is much greater. I found true love, and that's something no bet can buy. More than that, I became someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. That was the true victory." With that, James ended the conversation. He didn't need anything else to feel fulfilled. He had found something money couldn't offer: personal growth, genuine love, and inner peace. Ryan, though still perplexed, couldn't help but acknowledge the depth of his friend's transformation. He finally understood that the bet, which for him had been just a provocation, had led James down a path of healing and self-discovery that had transformed him forever. As Ryan said his goodbyes, still somewhat surprised, James looked at Evelyn, who watched him with an approving smile. He knew that, although the journey still had its challenges, he was on the right path. The love he now felt for Evelyn was genuine, but the true reward was having become the man she could love and respect. More than that, he had learned to love himself in a way he never thought possible. James had completed his journey of transformation. He didn't need Ryan's money because the true elixir he had sought was within himself. The man who was once driven by pride and the need for control had been reborn, and his greatest achievement wasn't a one bet but a renewed life full of meaning.